Hi, and welcome to the Anne and Pete show, where we try and have fun conversations about all sorts of AI and data topics. And this week we're doing something a little bit different. I'm actually going to be asking Anne some questions about her area, one of her many areas of expertise. Um, we've done episodes before this on models and open source and education and data and user privacy. Um, and I really wanted to get Anne's take on data collection, given all her experience with insights and intelligence, including competitive intelligence. So over to you, Anne.
So I love our conversations. And in case people aren't aware, I'm Anne and I'm a product person. And many years ago, I had an opportunity to meet Pete and was the data editor at O'Reilly Media. And I feel very fortunate to have had that meeting and had many conversations over the years. And my background is definitely within data. And one of the aspects is intelligence, right? Particularly competitive intelligence. So I've worked as both as an IC and team lead on intelligence teams for global companies, oftentimes focusing on data, including what I think of as high stakes domains. Like education, for example, is a high stakes domain because oftentimes it involves children. So people have a lot of attention on what happens to their kids. And when I was in that particular domain, it was also high stakes because the education data or technology deals or RFPs or tenders, depending on the country, would start at hundreds of thousands of dollars and then top out at millions. So when you have that cocktail, it becomes a lot of things to navigate for sure.
Yeah, no, I can only imagine. And I think we're both very passionate about user privacy and data collection. And honestly, as an engineer coming into this, kind of competitive intelligence just kind of sounds like spying. Uh, I've had some exposure to it now through doing more startup stuff. But can you talk about how you actually think about doing it ethically?
So it is absolutely possible to run a competitive intelligence program ethically. Absolutely, right? It's challenging. It's harder to do because for some reason, and I still don't understand why, but people will think, it's not okay for me to ask someone to rob a bank, but it's totally okay for me to do the equivalent with data collection. It's like totally okay for me to ask someone to do that. I just don't
Yeah,
maybe it's the spy movie thing, but that makes things harder, right? It's also harder because you need to be able to take a step back and understand the why behind the request for the data, right? Because then once you understand the why, then you can map out the techniques you need to deploy in order to acquire the data, what I used to refer to as, obtaining data with a clean data provenance, right? So it is absolutely possible to do that.
yeah, and I mean, how much does it help to understand the motivations of the people who are asking you for this intelligence?
I think it's like one of the top priorities that you have to have, right? Like when people have asked me about this in the past, I'll be super bluntly honest with them, right? About what's your tolerance for conflict, because you need to have those hard conversations. You need to have, and what's your actual ability to have empathy for your stakeholders, no matter who they are, right?
Yeah,
Because oftentimes you need to uncover why are they asking this? Because they may have certain KPIs or objectives or targeted outcomes for the data use. So you need to have those very real conversations. And that's sometimes it's not easy, right? But you need to understand that in order to map out the due diligence you need to do, right? In order to obtain the data with like a clean data provenance. So it is absolutely like a priority in terms of like understanding the why, for sure, for sure.
and that actually reminds me. Like years ago, I was at a conference, like around data, and somehow we had somebody from the CIA. And what was fascinating about what they talked about was um, there was a little bit of data, but then they had this enormous amount of provenance around that data. And the idea was like in any briefing, you could actually look at any word in any sentence and you could trace it back to find out which sources it had come from. Now, I don't imagine things were quite that extreme, but Like, how important was provenance?
When I was doing it, especially when I was put in a position to run a team, and that to me like just elevated the amount of responsibility in terms of ensuring the provenance, right? Because when you're just responsible for yourself, it's one thing, but all of a sudden when you're responsible for other people, I don't know about other people, but for me, it's just like it's,
Yeah.
it's all like the provenance needs to be squeaky clean, right? And that is where the hard work comes in, right? Because in order to track that level of providence, you do have to have that high tolerance or stubbornness to really look for it, right? And to track
Yeah.
what's going on. So it's harder and it may take a little bit longer, but it's absolutely possible. It's absolutely possible to do it ethically. Yeah.
So, has anybody ever asked you to be a cat burglar and like break into the competitors' offices or anything, you know, anything wacky like that?
I think that I was extremely lucky, and some people would say you were just extremely spoiled, Anne. But I was very lucky that I worked with executives who came from backgrounds with education data, right? Even some of the sales executives would have PhDs in psychometrics or assessment, so they had that grounding. And even the ones that didn't, oftentimes would sell into school districts that their kids were going to school in, right? So for
Yeah.
them, they were very supportive of ethical data collection. But again, I know that everybody's not as lucky, right? And that's why, like over the years, I've been really honest with them about, what's your tolerance for conflict, getting to the why and whatnot. Um, so I understand. I understand it's not an easy thing, but it's totally possible.
And, I know there's going to be a lot of people out there like me who, either hadn't run across competitive intelligence because they've been kind of, in the engineering world, or just have kind of, run across it but not really been deeply involved in it. Um, can you sort of just give some concrete examples of the sorts of things that might fall under that umbrella?
Oh, for sure. Like oftentimes when people are asking for spy oriented stuff, right, they're actually asking for things like what's an expansion strategy, right? What's the product roadmap for things? And that's the kind of stuff you can definitely find in aggregated data sets that's, collected ethically and publicly, right? Once upon a time, I was able to sit near someone that was a former producer of CNN Money. And so he was actually the one that pointed out this amazing site to me at the time that was well known in finance, but not well known in tech, right? It's called Seeking Alpha, right? So Seeking Alpha is a great site for like it has a repository of investor relations report, earnings calls, transcripts, and stuff like that. So if you're going through the transcripts, you can kind of gauge like where people are going for the expansion or product roadmap, right, for public companies.
Yeah.
So, but if you're in a situation where you're like, wait a minute, the company's in public, another way to go about it is through job descriptions, right?
Mm,
Because oftentimes in job descriptions, especially for like go to market people, the first paragraph will often say if it's a new, initiative or product or service, or
yeah.
if it's maintaining. So you'll know right away if it's like expansion or maintaining. And then they'll if it's a go to market person, they'll often ask for, oh, we want this person to have connections within a specific domain or at certain companies, right? And that'll be like a signal of this is what that company's target customer list is or their partner list. You're able to make inferences. And I think probably amongst my favorite to find out what someone's doing with the roadmap is just to look at product job descriptions and engineering job descriptions, especially engineering managers, right? Because if it's an
Mm,
engineering manager, they'll be like, oh, we want you to build out this new team for this new feature.
yeah.
It's like, so it's completely legit, right? Because you're not breaking into anything. It's all public information. It's all, you
Yeah.
know, out there, right? So those are examples of being able to ethically collect competitive intelligence without mirroring anything you see in the movies.
Yeah. And do you think the the companies who are putting up job descriptions and things like really like think or care much about the information that is contained, that is leaked in them in
I think
aggregate?
sometimes they do, but I think the want for them to get the right people outweighs that, right? I've definitely
Yeah.
been at companies where there are other methods of like once they realized how much information I was getting from social media, they actually implemented things about a lockdown on what people would say on social media. Right.
Yeah.
That has definitely happened. And another company I worked at, when they found out how much information I was getting from press releases, they said, we're not actually going to do so many. So
Yeah.
it's like a trade-off, right? But I find that job descriptions, because especially for technical roles or product roles or go-to-market roles, they do need to be specific, right?
Wow.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
I hadn't thought about the press releases. You know, I've sort of dabbled in journalism in the past, and I'm just amazed anybody reads them.
I think there's a lot of intelligence people that read them, and you can track baselines, and then when somebody veers from the baseline, and you go, okay, wait a second, what's going
Yeah,
on, right?
yeah, there's something actually. And are you just effectively Googling, or are you going to particular job websites that are known for like the industry? Like, I don't want you to spill all your secrets, but I'm just curious if there's tools for this, or if it just tends to be a kind of detective work you do yourself.
I think there's a lot of ways that you could do aggregates, right? Each domain will have aggregated data sets like Seeking Alpha, for example. So I would encourage people to look outside of tech and look at specific domains that are high risk or high compliance. So oftentimes those will be really clean data sets. Um, I also think like following the companies all the time, just doing your due diligence. Again, this is why it takes so much work, is that you're following the companies and you're creating a baseline of what the company is. And then so when you see it veer, then you're like, oh, wait a sec, they are doing
Mm.
something different, right? Or if they post a new job description, then you're able to like review it. So it's a lot of ongoing maintenance. So you can get all these aggregated feeds. It just takes a time to go through it and like to build up that knowledge base about those companies within your domain.
And I'm curious. This is probably not to do with anything you've done, but I've always heard like rumors about LinkedIn um, providing data to financial firms about companies hiring, and people changing job positions, and um, either them officially or people who are trying to scrape them.
Hmm.
And yeah, I've always found that really interesting, because it's not in the interest of either LinkedIn or the candidates or the companies to provide that data, but somebody wants to make some money on that. So anyway, that's just me thinking aloud really on that stuff.
Oh, for sure. And I think that definitely ties back to what you were talking about with user privacy protocols, right? And user agreements, that sometimes people don't realize what they're giving up when they sign those terms of service, right?
Yeah,
I haven't done that in particular, but I am aware of companies doing what you've said, right? And it's because the terms of service are so convoluted that they feel like their interpretation is that it's okay to do that, right?
yeah, and I think often people don't realize, like you're saying about social media, like you just put like one little seemingly innocuous fact, like hey, I'm moving to Seattle,
Mm-hmm.
and if you see a bunch of other people moving to Seattle who are working on a particular team or particular role or have particular skills, like I think it's often described as the mosaic effect.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
where it
So
actually starts to.
that's a prime example, right? You don't need to break any laws. You can just watch.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, thank you, Anne. I mean, that's really fascinating. Any last thoughts before we wrap up?
I definitely appreciate it. And I think that I would love people to have more of a default of let's do due diligence, and let's be respectful for people's data versus what's the shortest means to get there by any means necessary. That's the issue that I have when I see stuff like that play out.
No, makes a lot of sense. Well, awesome. Thanks so much, Anne. And thanks everybody for listening. Join us again next week. And goodbye.
Bye.